good, YouTube? It's me, boy Squid back in the next video. I've decided to play Handtraps during this upcoming format after Phantom Nightmares released, specifically over board breakers, and here's why. So I know a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh community has been hyping up certain board breakers, high impact cards like Triple Tactics Talent, Triple Tactics Trust, Super Polymerization, and yes, these are all great cards. But unfortunately, with the release of Phantom Nightmare, we're getting a lot of power creep that's going to change the format into a completely different format than it currently is. This is not a good representation of what the actual metagame is going to be after Phantom Nightmare comes out, because we have a lot of powerful cards, specifically the new Sinful Spoil stuff in tandem with the fire support like Promethean Princess. And from testing in this format specifically, I found that hand traps are absolutely required. My first point is that every deck can actually go first in this current format. You have decks like Fire King that just makes an insane board. You have decks like the Voiceless, aka Silent Forcer, which can also make a very, very hard to break board. The monsters can't be targeted because they have the barrier up. They potentially have the trap. They have access to Cerebus. They have Cerebus in hand to prevent you from targeting the monsters. They have the Omni Negate in the form of the Skull Guardian, and you're not able to destroy anything by battle because you're forced to attack ritual monsters. And a weapon 4050 attack monster is harder said than done to get rid of in the battle phase. Then you have other decks like Labyrinth. You know, they set a bunch of traps. They set up potentially an Eradicator Epidemic Virus, Rumple Toyful. There's the transaction rollback shenanigans as well that they can just pull off. Every deck can go first. In a 12-round tournament, you have to be able to go second because you're not going to be winning the majority of your dice rolls. If anything, it's closer to 50-50, right? If you're lucky. So being able to defend yourself going second is important. This is where board breakers are lacking. I found that the decks are just so powerful right now. For example, Fire King, they're going to put up a huge board, including the Amblo Whale plus potentially Appaloosa or IP Masquerena, having 5 or 6 cards in hand, and then a full graveyard with cards like Runix, a Link Monster to summon back off of Amblo Whale. They also have, of course, the Promethean Princess in the graveyard that can come back to start destroying things. So with a board breaker, there's nothing that specifically deals with everything, right? Board breakers are very specific in that only they deal with one thing. You have cards like Super Poly, they deal with the board, but then you have to deal with the cards in the graveyard. But there are some caveats with this card. You have to play a lot of extra cards in your extra deck, and nowadays, extra deck space is very tight, especially for the Fire Link decks, because your extra deck is basically your entire array of toolbox of cards that you want to use in certain scenarios like link climbing or certain matchups. There are a lot of cards that you actually need to have in your extra deck, and there's no space to play 2 or even 3 fusions for Super Polymerization. Not to mention that your opponent might not be committing to the board in a way that can be super polyed. I've seen boards where people end in Amblo Whale and Appaloosa, and those boards just can't be super polyed. And when you cannot lead your plays with Super Polymerization, it makes it a lot worse because you're kind of playing into their board. They're going to get a lot of value, and then yeah, sure, your Super Volley is live at the end of the smoke clearing, but you have to discard a card and invest basically 2 cards to get rid of your opponent's monsters when the damage has already been dealt. Cards like Soul Release are decent, but they only deal with the graveyard. It does not deal with the board, nor the cards in the hand. So it's very, very hard to play board breakers in a combination that deals with everything when decks like Fire King are diversifying their boards, where their end board is a mixture of cards on the field, cards in the hand, and cards in the graveyard. A lot like how decks in the past like Unchained have kind of functioned, where it was really hard for a board breaker to be highly effective to that range. This is where hand traps are especially useful. Now, you may argue that, oh, you know, one Nibiru or one Ash is not going to stop them. But this is actually wrong, because that one card, when used at the proper choke point, will actually make it so their end board is a lot weaker. For example, if you're using it against a Fire King deck where they go Snake Eyes Original to try and special summon out their Fire King Ponix to bridge into the Fire King plays, if you actually Ash here, you could potentially be cutting them off completely from the Fire King engine, assuming they did not open Island or Garunix in some combination, which is a very, very high chance that it's possible they didn't actually open those cards, right? So that means that they're only going to end off in a suboptimal Snake Eyes-esque Sinful Spoils board, and now it's a lot easier for us to deal with because we're not dealing with a Garunix in the graveyard, right? We're not dealing with Kieran coming back to non-targeting pop things, so it makes it a lot easier for us to potentially push back with the engine cards that we have in our hand, because they're only half comboing, they're not full comboing their board.
Really quickly, if you guys aren't already subscribed to the channel, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button at the bottom. It'll go a long way to support the channel. Other than that, thanks a lot for tuning in.
Similarly, there are a lot of hand traps that sometimes force your opponent to pass a turn. For example, cards like Drone Lockbird. If your opponent opens suboptimally and they have to start with something like a Bonfire that searches the deck, then that means they're potentially ending their turn on the spot. And there are a lot of hand traps that can do this now, especially. Even cards like Ash Blossom, sometimes when you're hitting their first play, they may be forced to pass because decks nowadays are very greedy, okay? They have to be able to go second again. So they're playing a lot of non-engine cards. And when that happens, the engine is very, very condensed. The starters are very condensed. It's a lot like how decks like Castira were. A lot of times they're opening a handful of like 3 or 4 non-engine cards, and then the one starter engine card that they absolutely need to get to resolve in order to play. So if they're going like in Ash, the Snake Eyes Ash in hand with like 4 hand traps, and I go normal summon Snake Eyes Ash, I'm desperately praying that this goes through. Well, one Veiler, Infirm, or potentially Ash Blossom on my Snake Eyes Ash could mean that I actually have to pass my turn on the spot. So there's always actually a chance, a reasonable chance, where decks are actually bricking now in response to 1 or 2 hand traps. This brings me to my next point. Multiple hand traps in tandem with each other often complement each other to the point where you can really whittle down your opponent's resources. If you have 2 or sometimes even 3 hand traps, a lot of times that's just enough for your opponent to pass. And then all we really need is 1 or 2 engine cards to get started, right? Like nowadays, every deck can start off 1 engine starter, 1 Snake Eyes Ash, 1 Bonfire, 1 Populous, anything just gets us started in our races. So assuming we have even 1 card or even 1 card plus an extender for our opponent's hand trap when they pass, then that means we're going to be in a lot better shape to win, especially because we're getting our battle phase, which means we get to be the onus to deal damage, to potentially OTK, and to pick apart what remaining resources they have on their board after we whittle down the board with our hand traps. My next point is during grind games, board breakers are just not particularly useful. You could have cards like Triple Tactics Talent that just do nothing in the grind game because your opponent has not been able to activate any monster card effects during your turn, right? Whereas if you pass on this with the tactics in your hand, you're really liable. You're really without a defense. But if I have hand traps in the grind game, I can still have defenses, you know? I may not be able to put up a huge board during the grind game. I'm grinding with my opponent. But if I have cards like Nibiru or Ash or Veiler, I can at least stop and mount a defense on my opponent's next turn while I'm grinding, whereas board breakers will not allow you to do that. And then if your opponent sees a key combo piece that they needed, they could potentially OTK you before you're able to take advantage of the board breaker on the consecutive turn. This brings me to my next point. Board breakers are very, very volatile, especially now that there are a lot of powerful going first cards that actually lock out of board breakers completely. For example, cards like Anti-Spell Fragrance. This card being flipped up means that you're not going to be able to activate cards like Triple Tactics Talent or Harpy's Feather Duster, Lightning Storm. Cards like that are just not going to be able to be activated. Soul Release as well. There are also cards like Secret Village of the Spellcasters, potentially, that I've seen some players kind of toying around with because we have a lot of Spellcasters now in the form of the Charmers, the Abel Star, you know, even cards like Celine, Relinquished Anima, that allow them to play Secret Village, and that means you're not playing any spell cards, so your board breakers will be null and void. Whereas if I had a hand trap in place of the board breakers, I potentially could have stopped my opponent or at least made it so they don't get to the Secret Village or whatever floodgate, and I'm still able to play past that floodgate with the engine that I have in my hand as opposed to having a bunch of spells. There are also cards like Magic Deflector, which stop quick play spell cards like Cosmic Cyclone. We have cards like Lancia, which shut down Evenly Matched completely, so you're skipping your battle phase and wasting a card out of your hand for basically no purpose, while Lancia is a blanket effect for the rest of your turn. And again, you know, board breakers are just not good against every single deck, right? There are a lot of decks that do different things. So certain board breakers like Soul Release being sided in specifically for Fire King may not be nearly as effective against decks like the Pure Snake Eyes deck or against the Ritual deck, the Skull Guardian deck. Like, these cards are just not very, very good. And nowadays in our side deck, we are very, very limited on space. So it's very hard to accommodate board breakers to deal with the vast majority of decks. But hand traps nowadays seem to be very effective against all of the decks because they're all doing some sort of searching or special summoning from deck in some sort of capacity, or special summoning 5 or more times. You know, so hand traps are always very, very fluid in that you can use them against every deck and sort of tweak them. You know, take out the hand traps that are not very effective against certain decks and replace them with better cards in the side deck. But for the vast majority of the part, like the 9 to 12 hand traps that we're playing are very, very powerful against all of the decks on the marketplace right now. Now, I don't want to say don't play board breakers at all. In my opinion, I know hand traps are good, but sometimes they don't get you 100% of the way there. They may carry you maybe 80, 85% of the way there with multiple hand traps, but you still need a couple of very meaty, high impact cards in order to win in that whittled down board state after you hand trap your opponent. So this is where a couple of key high impact board breakers could come in handy. And personally, I still think I'm going to side cards like Soul Release because they work very, very well with hand traps. So if I'm using hand traps to kind of stop them from playing out their full board, they still might have cards in the graveyard like Garunix or Promethean Princess, and then Soul Release is very, very high impact in that we get rid of their high impact defensive options that they have in the graveyard that they were planning to use on our turn, right? So you could definitely consider Soul Release. Other cards like Triple Tactics, Talent, or Thrust potentially as a package sided in going second, game 2 and 3 is very, very high impact because again, in the grind game, these kind of cards are very, very powerful because they allow you to do unfair things. You can draw 2 cards, you can steal monsters, non-targeting, you can rip your opponent's hand, and hand traps cannot do that, right? Hand traps are just 1-for-1 negations that are very, very soft. A lot of times they don't really trade 1-for-1 either. Cards like Valor, you know, you go neg, but you're stopping them from going plus infinite, right? So that's where like mini board breakers can actually come in handy. So personally, I'll be siding in some board breakers. So yeah, that's an overview of why I believe I'm going to be playing hand traps for the upcoming format. I'm sure a lot of players out there will agree as well. They're just so freaking versatile, and you know, you feel so safe when you're going first with a hand trap in your hand and you have a board, right? Because your opponent has to commit to the board to try and play through everything, and then boom, you hit them with a card like Nibiru or Drone Lockbird, and they're just shut out of the game. So I just love hand traps. I think I'm going to play them for the upcoming format. What do you guys think? Are you going to play board breakers, a mixture of both, or are you going to commit to hand traps exclusively? Let us know in the comments below, and also let us know your favorite hand traps and board breakers that you think are actually going to be highly effective throughout this upcoming, very close to tier 0 format. Other than that, we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.